The sea moaned like a wounded animal. Its breath rose in waves of salt and sorrow, carrying with it the cries of gulls that circled above the steamer's deck. The dawn was pale, sickly, as though even the sun hesitated to look upon those who fled across its waters. Wooden planks creaked beneath the weight of men, women, and children, faces hollowed by hunger, eyes glazed with memory. The air was damp, metallic, thick with rust and brine, and somewhere below the deck, chains clattered in rhythm with the tide, a sound that carried too many echoes from a war only just lost. Among the huddled shapes was a widow, her hands clutched tightly around a locket, whose clasp had corroded into a reddish scar of iron. She pressed it to her chest, as if to stop her heart from escaping into the wind. Within that small relic lived the portrait of a husband who had fallen on foreign soil, his bones claimed by the earth of a homeland she would never see again. Around her, the air reeked of sickness, of damp wool and unwashed flesh, but she inhaled it as one inhales penance. The locket trembled against her skin like a wound refusing to close. Behind her, a boy whispered in his mother's ear, "How much farther?" His voice was thin, like parchment singed at the edges. She hushed him, but her eyes searched the horizon, as if to summon a shore through sheer desperation. Every creak of timber, every roll of the sea, reminded them of what they had abandoned. A South burning with defeat, fields left to rot, manors stripped and shuttered, families torn apart by freedom's triumph and slavery's fall. At last, land rose from the mist. Brazil, a word that tasted both foreign and promising, like fruit not yet ripe. The widow stepped onto soil stained red with clay, her shoes sinking into the earth that clung stubbornly, as though determined to remind her she was no longer at home. Tropical birds cried from branches heavy with fruit, their colors mocking the drab grays and browns of exile's attire. Around her, the settlers exhaled prayers, their voices quivering with relief. But her hands still trembled, for she knew that survival was never merely a matter of reaching land. It was a matter of building a life upon ground that did not want them. The first nights were restless. The air hung heavy with humidity, choking and damp, pressing against lungs used to drier soil. The small wooden huts they raised crackled with strange fires, their walls lined with tools imported from broken plantations. Candle smoke spiraled through thatched roofs and mingled with the droning of cicadas. Yet amidst the alien music of the tropics, they tried to summon echoes of the South. Women cooked pecans and cornmeal, trying to disguise the cassava and tropical roots that now filled their bellies. Hymns were sung in fractured English, voices breaking into Portuguese where memory failed. Still, the land resisted them. Mosquitoes descended like plagues, fevers burned through camps, and children coughed until their ribs seemed ready to split. Livestock stumbled and died in the heat, their bodies bloating under the relentless sun. At night, silence was broken by whispers, murmurs of regret, and the occasional scream muffled beneath quilts. Some settlers clung to the dream of return, convinced that this exile was but a season. Others, hardened by loss, muttered that home was ash now, and ash cannot be reclaimed. In the center of their new settlement, they built a graveyard before they built a chapel. Death came swifter than redemption. Rough-hewn crosses rose from the soil, their names carved with shaky hands. Some in English, some in Portuguese, some simply with initials because grief had stolen the strength for more. At the heart of the graveyard, a stone obelisk was erected, its sharp lines defiant against the lush wilderness. Upon it, they draped a Confederate flag, already frayed and faded, its stars and bars whispering into the wind like a prayer to a god who had turned his face away. By torchlight, mothers knelt at its base, their shawls damp with tears, their fingers stained red from the earth they pressed into graves. Children clutched wooden dolls carved from ship timbers, their hollow eyes reflecting the firelight. Men stood stiffly, hats pressed to their chests, their silence as loud as mourning bells. This cemetery became the true heart of their community, not the fields they cleared, not the homes they built, but the soil that swallowed their kin and preserved their names in stone. Night deepened, and with it the weight of memory. The widow sat before the obelisk, her locket pressed once more against her chest. She whispered words not in prayer, but in confession, that she had abandoned the ruins of her family home, that she had boarded a ship with strangers, that she had hoped, though she would never say it aloud, for a life not built on chains. Around her, voices rose in song, but the hymn was fractured, torn between languages, wavering like the flames that lit their faces. Above them, the moon was heavy and low, its pale light veiled by clouds. Shadows stretched long across the graves, blending with the flicker of torches. The cemetery pulsed with silence, broken only by the sound of insects in the dark and the distant cry of some unseen bird. In this mingling of voices, smoke, and sorrow, the community bound itself together, not by victory, but by the stubborn refusal to let memory dissolve. And yet, memory itself became a burden. The South they longed for lived only in fragments, in recipes altered by necessity, in hymns mangled by new tongues, in stories whispered by candlelight to children who would never walk those fields. The land beneath their feet demanded they change, demanded they become something else. But still, they clung to what was gone, as though the red soil of Brazil might somehow hold the essence of Georgia, Alabama, or Mississippi if they bled enough prayers into it. As the night waned, the widow's locket slipped from her hand, falling into the dirt before the obelisk. She did not pick it up. Instead, she stared at the stars until her vision blurred. Somewhere deep within, she knew the truth, that their final stand was not one of muskets and cannon fire, but of memory against time, of pride against survival. And that even here, in the shadows of foreign trees, slavery's ghost lingered. Whispered in the hymns, echoed in the tools, etched into the very soil they claimed as sacred. The torches burned low. One by one, figures drifted back into huts, their footsteps muffled in the clay. The cemetery remained, the obelisk standing proud, the flag flapping faintly in the night wind. A bell tolled from a distant chapel, hollow, solemn, as though marking not an hour, but the heartbeat of exile. The widow rose, leaving the locket in the dirt, and walked into the darkness of her hut. Her shadow lingered across the graves for a moment before vanishing. And in that silence beneath the heavy moon, the story stretched onward, toward new rituals, new conflicts, and the question of whether exile could ever become home. The horizon bled red at dawn. A haze clung to the plains, rising like smoke from a battlefield long extinguished. Colonel Norris stood alone in the silence, his figure dark against the sweep of banana palms and the sprawling emptiness of Brazil's earth. He bent down, scooping a fistful of soil into his palm. The grit clung to his skin, rich, foreign, and heavy, tasting of iron when he pressed it to his lips. It was not Alabama, nor Georgia, nor any field he had ever known. And yet, if he was to live, it would have to be home. Behind him, the remnants of a broken people stirred. Wagons creaked under the weight of trunks and tools salvaged from ruin. Children clung to skirts, wide-eyed, their bare feet dragging through mud still damp with morning dew. Mothers held them close, whispering comforts that had no anchor, while fathers walked in silence, their faces weathered into masks of stone. They carried more than luggage. They carried memory, and memory was a burden that bent the spine and soured the air. Norris straightened, staring into the distance, where the air shimmered with heat. He remembered the smoke of his plantation burning, the echo of rifles, the last defiant song sung before silence drowned them out. He remembered the faces of men buried without ceremony, left to the mercy of vultures. His hat brim, sweat-stained and battered, still bore the dust of that lost war. Now, in this strange land, the same brim shielded him from a different sun. The settlers tried to build a rhythm. They planted cotton once more, kneeling in unfamiliar soil, praying that the crop would remember them, that it would grow as it had across the American South. Nights were lit with kerosene lamps, their glow a frail imitation of hearth fires left behind. Letters were written by flickering light, ink blotched and uneven, carrying messages to kin still clinging to the ashes of home. Come, they urged, there is life here, if not peace. But life was not peace. The air was thick, heavy with insects and the cries of birds unfamiliar. Fever stalked the nights, rising like mist, leaving children drenched in sweat and mothers weeping at their bedside. Portuguese words drifted through the villages, their rhythms alien, their vowels curling like smoke. Settlers stumbled through them, their tongues tripping, their pride choking at every misstep. To survive, they had to learn. But each word felt like surrender, a fragment of their identity traded for survival. Still, faith held them together. On Sundays across the river, voices rose in hymns, fractured English weaving with uncertain Portuguese, each verse trembling with longing. Men stood stiff-backed, women bowed their heads, and children clutched hands worn calloused by both work and prayer. Their chapels were rough-hewn, wooden walls breathing with the scent of sap and smoke. Yet within those walls, they felt for a heartbeat as though they belonged. At the settlement's heart, the cemetery grew. Each grave was a ledger of failure and endurance. Crosses crowded the red soil, some carved with names, others with initials scratched in haste before grief consumed the strength to write more. And towering above them all was the obelisk, hewn of stone and sharp against the sky. At its base, they draped their flag, the emblem of a cause lost but never relinquished. Its stars dimmed, its fabric tattered, but still it stood, a relic of memory in a land that could not care less for it. At dusk, families gathered around the obelisk. Mothers pressed rosemary to the stone. Fathers removed hats with solemn gestures. Children stared at the symbol as though it might speak. Lantern light shimmered across their faces, and for a moment, grief and pride became indistinguishable. They mourned the past, yet clung to it. This was not merely remembrance, it was defiance. To let go of the cause was to betray the dead. To hold on to it was to remain chained to loss. Norris stood often at the edge of these vigils, his hands clasped behind his back, his eyes fixed on the obelisk. He heard no answers in the silence, only the echo of drums from a war that had ended and the whisper of soil demanding they choose, to adapt or to perish. One night, as clouds smothered the stars, the widow whose locket had clung to her chest since the voyage approached the obelisk. She laid the locket at its base, pressing her lips to the cold stone. Her voice was thin, but it carried through the hush. For all we have lost. Torches sputtered in the damp air, casting her shadow long across the graves. Around her, silence deepened, as though the earth itself paused to listen. When the bell rang from the chapel, it was heavy, hollow, reverberating across the plains. Its toll marked no hour, no season. It was the sound of exile itself, binding them together in grief. As the settlers turned back toward their huts, their faces lit in weary amber by torchlight, Norris remained at the cemetery's edge. He stared into the horizon, where the red earth met the black sky, and wondered how long the dead could hold the living hostage. The night grew still. Lanterns dimmed. The obelisk stood in silhouette, sharp and unyielding, its flag whispering into the darkness. And in that silence, the question lingered, whether these plains would remain a foreign graveyard, or whether they could ever become a home. The morning air lay heavy with mist, a pale veil over fields still raw with new furrows. Dew clung to the tender cotton seedlings like beads of sorrow, each droplet catching what little light the dawn could summon. A woman knelt in the soil, her hands darkened with earth, her fingers trembling as though each seed she pressed into the ground was an act of both hope and betrayal. Behind her eyes echoed the voice of her daughter, left behind in the ruins of their home. "Don't let them take our memories, Mama." The plow, imported at great cost from Alabama, rested at the edge of the field. Its iron frame bore scars of another land, its edges rusted from the long voyage across the sea. The woman ran her hand along its surface, tracing the grooves as one traces old scars on skin. It was more than a tool. It was a relic of a past, now buried in ash. She pressed her palm against its cold frame and felt a shiver run through her. It did not belong here, not in this red soil that clung stubbornly to her skirts and painted her boots with clay. Yet here it was, like her, like all of them, exiled, displaced, forced into a new covenant with survival. All around her, voices rose in prayer. Settlers murmured verses in fractured English, sometimes breaking into hesitant Portuguese, the syllables thick and clumsy in their mouths. Children knelt beside their parents, their small fingers tracing the furrows, as if to understand how bread might grow from strange earth. The acrid smoke of burning vegetation drifted through the air, a scent both cleansing and mournful, as though the land itself was being scourged to make way for them. That night, the settlement swelled with mingled sounds, the scratch of pens on parchment as letters were written, their ink blurred by the unsteady glow of kerosene lamps. The crackle of fires as families shared meager meals of cassava root reshaped into something resembling the dishes of their memory. The muffled coughs of children whose lungs carried fevers that no prayer could break. Mothers whispered lullabies in soft tones, trying to keep the cadence of old songs alive even as the words faltered. The hunger was constant, It sat in their bellies like a stone, twisting and gnawing. Pecans and peanuts, staples of comfort, existed now only as memories conjured on the tongue. Instead, the foreign starches of this land filled their bowls, strange and coarse. A child tugged at his mother's skirt and asked, "Why doesn't it taste the same?" She smoothed his hair, tears burning behind her eyes, and told him it would one day. But her voice betrayed her, cracked and worn, because she knew it never would. The days blurred into one another, each marked by toil, fever, and the unshakable sense of living as shadows of themselves. Doors creaked on new homes built with unsteady hands, the sound resonating through the night like lost voices demanding witness. Tools hung on walls, axes, hammers, plows, not as signs of progress, but as reminders of the old world that had been torn from them. They lived surrounded by relics, each object carrying the weight of memory too heavy to cast aside. At dusk, the cemetery became their sanctuary. Surrounded by a crude wooden fence, it was the first place consecrated by the settlers, even before their chapels. Ghostly lantern light flickered across carved names: Norris, Gunter, Oliver. The stones bore witness to the cost of survival in this strange exile. Around the obelisk, rough and unpolished but rising with defiant pride, a Confederate flag hung limp, its fabric already frayed by the dampness of tropical nights. The widow who had carried her locket from the sea bent low before a grave, pressing her lips to the soil. Her prayer was silent, but her hands shook as she clutched the earth, staining her palms. The lanterns cast her shadow long and distorted, a silhouette that seemed more ghost than flesh. Children stood nearby, clutching dolls carved from ship timber, their hollow eyes reflecting the torchlight. Fathers bowed their heads, their silence a language older than any hymn. In those moments, the community was bound not by triumph, but by grief. Death was the one constant, the one inheritance they could not escape. Yet in that grief was also defiance. Every name carved into stone, every hymn sung in fractured tongues, every tear pressed into foreign earth was an act of resistance against erasure. They may have been exiles, but they would not be forgotten. The air grew heavy as night deepened. The cicadas sang their endless chorus, and the forest pressed close, as though the land itself listened to the murmurs of these strangers. The widow lifted her face toward the stars, her locket still clutched against her breast. For a fleeting moment, she thought she saw constellations she recognized from home. But when she blinked, the sky had changed. These were not the heavens of her childhood. They were foreign, unyielding, demanding she accept her exile. One by one, lanterns were extinguished. The cemetery fell into darkness, leaving only the faint shimmer of moonlight on stone and wood. The graves lay silent, but in their silence resided the heartbeat of the settlement. This was the soil where their ghosts would take root, where their memories would cling, even as their bodies failed. As the widow rose, the locket slipped from her hand and sank into the dirt. She did not retrieve it. Instead, she pressed her palms together, her fingers still stained with soil, and whispered into the night, "Remember us." The words hung in the air, fragile, almost lost to the wind. Beyond the graves, the settlement huddled in shadow. Smoke rose from chimneys, thin and pale, dissipating into the vast darkness. The plow stood alone in the field, its silhouette stark against the moonlit soil, as if watching, waiting. The widow's whisper was carried into the silence, woven into the sounds of the night. The rustling of leaves, the sigh of the wind, the distant cry of a night bird. It became part of the land itself, binding memory to exile, grief to survival. And in that silence, a question lingered. Could the ghosts they planted in sacred ground ever allow them to grow roots of their own? The graves waited, the soil waited, and so did history. A veil of lace trembled in the glow of candlelight. It hung from the shoulder of a grieving mother, its fabric worn thin, edges frayed, yet clinging still to dignity. Her hands were clasped tight around a rosary, beads smoothed not by time, but by desperation. The chapel air was thick with smoke from kerosene lamps, their flames wavering as if caught between this world and the next. Each flicker cast her face in alternating light and shadow, the lines of sorrow etched deeper with every breath she took. Outside, the scent of magnolia lingered faintly, carried across the humid night air, but it mingled with the acrid sting of smoke from fields being burned and cleared. It was a perfume both sweet and bitter, a reminder of the beauty and violence of survival. Her lips moved in whispers, half-formed psalms muttered in the English of her childhood, interrupted by the curling syllables of Portuguese drifting through the chapel windows. The languages collided and faltered, just as she and her people had, caught between belonging and exile. Around her, other figures bowed their heads, veils glistening in the trembling light. Some clutched Bibles worn at the edges, others grasped crucifixes carved hurriedly from Brazilian wood. The walls of the chapel were rough, the boards still exhaling sap, the smell of resin seeping into prayer. On a table nearby rested a pie of vinegar and pecans, not quite as it had been in the South, but offered as though memory itself could be consumed. Every bite carried longing, every crumb tasted of loss. A child's cough broke the hush. Heads turned briefly, eyes searching, before sinking again into their ritual. It was not just prayer that bound them in this place. It was silence, heavy and reverent, broken only by the occasional wail of an infant or the crack of wood in the stove. Above them, shadows stretched long across the rafters, as if unseen hands moved along the beams. The building seemed alive, a creature breathing with them, trembling with every hymn whispered into its ribs. Beyond the thin walls, the tropics whispered their own prayers. The rustle of banana leaves, the mournful cries of night birds, the crackle of distant fires, all bled into the cadence of the service. The settlers prayed not only against hunger and fever, but against the wilderness itself, as though the land sought to consume them. Every shadow was an enemy. Every gust of wind carried rumors of defeat. At the edge of the settlement, the cemetery bell tolled. Its voice was deep, metallic, reverberating through the soil and into the bones of those who knelt in the chapel. Each strike carried the weight of remembrance. With every toll, the veil on the grieving mother's shoulder seemed to shimmer, catching the light, as if she herself were tethered between the living and the dead. When the service ended, the congregation moved slowly toward the door. Torchlight glowed outside, hazy in the night, casting halos of smoke around bowed heads. They walked together in procession, their voices hushed, their steps deliberate. Children held hands with parents, barefoot feet scuffing against clay, skirts brushing damp earth. They moved toward the graveyard, where the obelisk loomed like a sentinel, sharp against the night sky. The grieving mother knelt first. She pressed her rosary to the stone, whispering a name too soft to catch. Behind her, others joined, laying small tokens. Rosemary sprigs, letters scrawled in uneven ink, a single hand-carved doll placed by a child too young to understand. The lanterns flickered across their faces, carving lines of grief into the skin, lines that seemed to age them by years in a single night. The veil caught in the wind. It lifted slightly, shimmering, becoming something almost spectral. In its flutter, some saw a ghost, a sign, perhaps even forgiveness. To others, it was merely fabric. Yet the moment lingered, suspended, the veil an emblem of exile, of faith stretched thin, of memory refusing to dissolve. Above, the sky churned with clouds, the moon smothered in their grasp. A single star broke through, faint, a pinprick of light above the red soil, and bowed heads. The mother lifted her eyes to it, her lips parting as though to speak, but no sound came. Only the toll of the bell answered her silence, reverberating like a heartbeat across the fields. The procession dispersed. Figures melted back into the dark, lanterns swinging gently in their hands. The air was damp, heavy, filled with the scent of earth and smoke. Yet the image of the veil, lit briefly by firelight, lingered long after the torches had burned low. In that fragile night, faith was both anchor and chain. It bound them to memory, kept them upright when despair threatened to bury them. But it also tethered them to a cause that had already crumbled, a homeland that no longer wanted them, a history stained and unyielding. As the mother rose from the grave, her rosary still clutched tight. The veil slipped slightly, catching on the stone of the obelisk. She paused, fingers trembling as she freed it, the fabric brushing against the cold granite. For a moment, it looked as though she might leave it there, a ghost among the graves. But she pulled it back over her shoulder and walked into the darkness, the veil trailing faintly behind her like a shadow unwilling to let go. The bell tolled once more. Its echo stretched across the settlement, across the fields, across the wilderness, pressing in on every side. It was not just the call of death. It was a reminder, a summons, a question. And as the night closed around them, it whispered of what was yet to come, of rituals deeper, of conflicts sharper, of a people who could not decide whether they were burying the past or carrying it with them into every dawn. The night pressed heavy upon the village, a darkness thick with smoke and memory. Lanterns sputtered to life one by one, their flames casting trembling halos against moss-draped headstones. In the center of the cemetery, where graves rose like teeth from the earth, a hush gathered. The people assembled in silence, their breath visible in the damp air, skirts whispering against the grass. Above them, banners sagged, their cloth torn and stained, swaying faintly in the night breeze. The festa began not with music, but with a prayer. A monk, his robe patched and threadbare, lifted a trembling hand toward the obelisk that towered over the graves. His voice was low. A murmur meant more for the dead than the living. Torches flickered, their smoke curling upward like a second procession, vanishing into the dark canopy of trees. The faces illuminated in that glow seemed carved from the same stone as the headstones. Gaunt, weary, unyielding. Then, faint at first, the sound of a fiddle rose. Its strings wept with a mournful tone, stretching across the gathering like a lament. A tambourine joined, then voices, low and fractured, clinging to rhythms half-remembered from another world. Children shifted restlessly, their small hands clutching the hems of their mother's skirts. The music swelled, yet beneath it, grief remained, stitched into every note. A woman in silk, her hoop skirt faded, but still commanding, stepped forward. She smoothed the fabric with a practiced gesture, as though muscle memory carried her back to ballrooms long since burned. Her eyes scanned the crowd, the firelight reflecting in them like embers. She began to move, slowly, deliberately, her heels striking the earth in time with the fiddle's cry. Each step echoed against the base of the obelisk, each motion a heartbeat of defiance. Others followed. Men and women circled together, their shadows sprawling long across the graves. Some danced with stiff backs, pride keeping sorrow at bay. Others wept openly, their tears glistening in torchlight. Children mimicked the steps, stumbling in bare feet, their innocence suspended between pride and guilt. The air was thick with scents, roasted cassava, fried chicken, vinegar pie cooling on wooden tables. Southern fare mingled with Brazilian spices, a strange marriage of memory and necessity. Smoke from the fires drifted among the dancers, painting the air with a haze that blurred faces into ghosts. Laughter rose in pockets, brittle and fleeting, collapsing quickly back into silence. At the edge of the gathering, the plague doctor stood apart, his mask long since cracked, yet still worn like armor. The hollow eyes of the beak reflected the torchlight, watching, always watching. His presence was tolerated, perhaps even needed, though mothers pulled their children closer when his shadow passed. He was a reminder that death was never far, even on nights meant for remembrance. As the dance wound tighter, the banner above them sagged lower, its edges charred. A gust of wind caught it, snapping it into motion, the stars and bars barely visible in the dim glow. Its tattered form fluttered like a ghost above the living and the dead alike. For a moment, all eyes lifted toward it, silence overtaking the music. The flag was no longer just a symbol, it was a wound, reopened every time the cloth stirred. The monk stepped forward again, raising a hand. His voice trembled as he began a hymn, the words fractured between languages. English and Portuguese collided in the air, neither fully grasped, both burdened by sorrow. Yet in the mingling of tongues, something new was born. Not unity, not yet, but a fragile thread binding them together. Children knelt near the graves, their hands pressing sprigs of rosemary into the soil. A mother whispered into her child's ear, "So they will not be forgotten." The child's small fingers trembled as he laid the herb upon the dirt, his wide eyes reflecting the torch's glow. Around him, others followed, offerings of food, cloth, and letters written on parchment curled at the edges. The night deepened, shadows lengthened, and the music grew softer, as though exhausted. The silk-clad woman sank to her knees at the base of the obelisk, her hands pressed flat against the stone. Tears streaked her face, but her voice rose in a final song, raw and cracked. It was a ballad of home, of fields left behind, of names whispered into dust. The crowd joined, their voices rising into the night air, weaving grief and memory into one unbroken lament. When the last note faded, silence returned. Only the crackle of torches and the distant call of a night bird remained. The flag sagged once more, limp, its shadow stretching across the graves like a shroud. The people lingered, unwilling to leave, as though the moment itself was sacred, fragile, easily shattered by dawn. At last, one by one, they drifted away. Mothers carried sleeping children. Fathers gathered tools and lanterns. Monks extinguished candles with careful hands. The cemetery emptied, leaving only the obelisk, the flag, and the dead to keep watch. The silk-clad woman remained a moment longer. She pressed her cheek against the cold stone of the obelisk, whispering words no one else could hear. Then she rose, her skirt brushing the soil, and walked slowly back into the shadows. The torchlight dimmed, smoke curled upward, vanishing into the night. The festa was over, but its echo lingered, in the soil, in the graves, in the hearts of those who bore exile's burden. And as the night surrendered to silence, the question remained, had they honored the dead, or merely bound themselves tighter to their chains of memory? The sky churned with clouds, the stars hidden, but somewhere beyond, dawn waited. A dawn that promised not relief, but the relentless weight of another day. Dawn broke in silence. The first light crept across the fields like a thief, pale and unsteady, sliding over rows of cotton still slick with dew. Each droplet shimmered like broken glass, fragile, trembling in the cool air before dissolving into the rising heat. The land was red beneath it all, the earth of Brazil swallowing seeds and sorrows alike. A young boy knelt in the soil, his small fingers brushing against a cotton bloom just opening, white and soft against the stained ground. His breath caught, and his question carried into the stillness. "Mama, where did we come from?" His mother stood behind him, her cloak draped over her shoulders, her face lined with shadows though the sun had barely risen. She placed a trembling hand upon his shoulder, her touch both anchor and burden. Her eyes lifted to the horizon, where the Southern Cross still clung faintly to the sky, fading into the light. It was not the constellation she had known as a child, yet it hung above them now like a sentinel, indifferent to memory, demanding acceptance. Behind them, the graveyard loomed. Wooden crosses leaned crookedly in the earth, carved hastily with names, initials, or sometimes nothing at all. The obelisk stood sharp against the dawn, its flag drooping in the still air, its cloth already frayed by rain and wind. Each grave was a ledger, each stone a whispered story. The boy's gaze shifted toward it, his question still echoing in the morning silence. From the farmhouse, the smell of kerosene lamps lingered, mingling with the bitter aroma of black coffee and the heavy dampness of the tropics. Cicadas began their endless song, filling the air with a drone that seemed both eternal and oppressive. The shutters creaked as condensation dripped from their wooden frames. Inside, families stirred. Some prayed before battered Bibles. Others stoked fires, the smoke trailing into the humid air. The boy spoke again, his voice lilted with a hesitant blend of English and Portuguese. He began reciting fragments of hymns he had heard in chapel, the words broken, fractured, caught between two worlds. His mother listened, her lips pressed into a thin line, her eyes glistening. She saw in him both the past and the future, a child rooted in exile, singing a song that was not entirely his own. Her memory wandered. She remembered her own mother's kitchen, the smell of bread, the familiar rhythm of hymns sung in perfect English, the steady toll of church bells in the South. Now those memories came like shadows through fog, distant and half-forgotten. She longed to give her son a home, but what home was left to give? This soil was foreign. This sky was not theirs. And yet it was all he would ever know. The boy rose, brushing dirt from his knees, his hands still stained with the soil. He looked at his mother with a gaze too solemn for his years, as though he knew more than he should. In that look was a truth neither of them could escape. The past was gone, buried in graves they had carried across an ocean, and the future belonged to a land that would never let them forget they were strangers. The cicadas fell silent for a moment, as if the earth itself held its breath. A bird cried overhead, its call sharp, cutting through the dawn. The boy flinched, his eyes searching the sky, his body tensing as though expecting danger. His mother pulled him close, her hand pressing firmly against his back, her voice a whisper. "Do not fear, the land listens." But she knew her own words were fragile, brittle as the parchment pages of the Bible hidden beneath their roof. She had no answers. The land did not listen. It demanded. It demanded sweat, blood, prayer, and surrender. And still, it gave little in return. Behind them, the cemetery seemed to hum in the dawn. The obelisk cast its long shadow across the fields, stretching toward them, reminding them of the dead who lingered in memory and in stone. The boy's eyes followed that shadow, his small fingers curling tighter around his mother's hand, his gaze fixed on the flag, limp and lifeless, yet somehow still speaking. The mother's thoughts sank into silence. She remembered the nights filled with music, the festa beneath the flags, the dancing that blurred grief with defiance. But those moments passed quickly, leaving only the quiet weight of survival. Every dawn was the same: toil, hunger, the press of heat, and the reminder that they were tethered to memory they could neither abandon nor return to. The boy broke free gently from her grasp. He stepped toward the soil, placing his small hand upon it as though it could answer the question that lingered still. Where had they come from, and where would they go? The sun edged higher, the Southern Cross fading into invisibility. He stood in the glow, fragile and resolute, a child born of ashes, carrying a legacy he could not yet name. His mother's heart ached. She saw in him not only her son, but every child in the settlement, each one a bridge between a dead homeland and a living exile. They would grow into this soil, their tongues bending to new languages, their faith reshaped by necessity, their memories tangled between what was and what would be. She reached out once more, her hand brushing his hair. Her voice trembled. "This is where we are, my son. This is where we must remain." The boy looked back at her, his eyes still fixed on the graves, the flag, the obelisk rising against the light. He said nothing. Silence stretched between them, deep and unbroken, as though even words could not carry the weight of their truth. The sun lifted higher, burning away the mist. The cotton shimmered faintly in the new light, fragile blossoms trembling on stalks rooted in foreign soil. The boy and his mother stood in silence, their shadows stretching long, reaching toward the graves behind them. And there, in the hush of dawn beneath the fading Southern Cross, the settlement waited, suspended between past and future, between memory and surrender, between silence and the question of whether exile could ever become home. A gust of wind carried ash across the threshold of the hut, lifting it into the air like ghostly snow. It swirled in the dim light, drifting toward the hearth where the flames burned low, their glow flickering across walls of rough wood. The air smelled of smoke, citrus gone sour, and damp earth. A man stood before the fire, his face carved with lines of sorrow, his eyes reflecting the flame as though it were the last ember of a world he once knew. In his hand he held a rusted key, its teeth jagged, useless now, yet heavy with meaning. Once it had opened the gates of his plantation, doors long since shattered and claimed by others. Now it was nothing but metal, but in his palm it seemed to burn. He closed his fingers around it, his knuckles white, as if he could will the past into reopening. His voice broke the silence, hoarse and trembling. Names. Names of sons lost to war, whispered into the fire as though the flame might carry them upward. The Portuguese he had learned stumbled from his tongue, broken and heavy. He could no longer speak their language cleanly, nor his own without grief. Behind him, the hearth crackled. Shadows crawled up the walls, twisting into shapes that resembled the silhouettes of those he had lost. He reached for the Bible on the table, its leather cracked, its pages fragile and scented faintly of lavender tucked there years before. He placed the key beside it, the two objects lying side by side, relics of a past he could neither bury nor live within. The fire's glow illuminated them both, sanctifying them, condemning them. Outside, the village stirred in silence. Barefoot children shuffled through the mud, carrying buckets of water. Their mothers bent over cook fires, grinding cassava with tired arms, the smell mingling with wood smoke. Men moved among the fields, their hands blackened with soil that never softened to their touch. Life continued in exile's rhythm, each act performed with a quiet desperation, each gesture weighted with memory. The man turned toward the wall, where a crude wooden cross leaned, its grain marked with a carved date and the names of the vanished. His breath caught in his throat. He remembered the sound of chains in the distance, the cries of a war that had burned everything he knew, the silence that followed. The cross was not just for his family. It was for all of them, for an entire cause buried in blood and fire and carried here across the sea. His knees buckled. He sank to the floor, his hand pressed against the dirt. The texture was different than the earth of his homeland. Thicker, redder, clinging to his skin with a stubbornness he could never tame. He whispered again, names falling like ashes from his lips. He spoke to the soil, to the fire, to the silence itself, begging it to remember. From beyond the door came the sound of a hymn. Soft, broken voices rose in fractured unison. Women sang in English, their tones trembling, while men answered in Portuguese, hesitant, uncertain. The languages collided and merged, creating something neither pure nor whole, but undeniably alive. The sound seeped through the cracks of the hut, mingling with the crackle of the hearth. The man lifted his head. For a moment, he felt the urge to join, to let his voice be carried into the night. But his throat closed around the words. He remained silent, his breath shallow, his eyes fixed on the cross leaning in the corner. The door creaked open, a draft sweeping in, carrying with it the damp scent of rain and sugarcane. His wife stepped in quietly, her veil damp, her eyes red. She set down a bundle of herbs beside the Bible and laid her hand on his shoulder. He did not look at her, but he leaned into the weight of her touch. She said nothing. They had both spoken too many words to the dead. The living required only silence. Outside, a procession passed, lanterns swaying, torches burning in the drizzle. The villagers moved toward the cemetery, their shadows stretching across the wet earth, each figure hunched, each face illuminated by fire. The obelisk rose in the distance, sharp against the storm-lit sky, its flag sagging in the rain. The man rose slowly, his body trembling. He took the key in his hand once more, then placed it deliberately on the table beside the Bible and the herbs. He left it there. It was no longer a key, but a chain, and he was weary of its weight. He stepped out into the rain, the mud sucking at his boots, the air thick with smoke and song. He joined the procession, his face lifted toward the obelisk, his eyes catching the firelight. He felt the ash still clinging to his skin, as though it followed him, refusing to be shaken loose. The hymn swelled louder as the villagers gathered around the graves. Torches illuminated the crosses, the obelisk, the flag. The man stood among them, his wife at his side, their hands entwined. For a moment, as the hymn reached its final verse, he felt something stir. Not peace, not home, but a thread of belonging woven from shared grief. When the hymn ended, silence returned. The torches hissed in the rain. The flag clung heavy to the stone, its colors bleeding into the night. The man closed his eyes, his lips moving once more in the quiet, naming the dead. He did not expect an answer. He only wanted the silence to carry them, to hold them, to remember. And as the rain fell harder, the procession dispersed, each lantern dimming one by one. The man lingered, his hand pressed against the obelisk, his breath steady now. Ash clung to his skin, firelight burned in his eyes, and in the darkness of exile, he whispered the words he had not dared until now. We remain. The wind swallowed his voice, carrying it into the storm. And somewhere beyond the graves, beyond the fields, beyond the Southern Cross, dawn waited, heavy, relentless, and certain.